In 1926, a young analyst walked into a library in Washington and found something nobody else had bothered to look for. Northern Pipeline Company was trading at $65 a share. The same company was sitting on railroad bonds worth $95 a share. $65 buying $95 of assets. The numbers were sitting in a public filing the whole time. That young analyst would go on to write the book that taught the world how to read a balance sheet, and 3 years later, he watched 70% of his own money disappear. Not because he miscalculated anything, because he stopped listening to the man who wrote the book. My name is Benjamin Graham. I don't say that first, because what matters tonight isn't who I am. It's a mistake I made more than once, that I suspect you've made too, or will. By the end of this, you'll understand something most investors never learn, until it costs them dearly. Knowing the arithmetic of a business has almost nothing to do with surviving the market. The two skills live in different rooms of the mind, and only one of them is taught in school. We'll go 3 places tonight. First, to a pipeline company in 1926 to see how a plain fact sitting in plain sight can be invisible to almost everyone. Second, to my own ledger in 1930, the worst year of my professional life, to see how a man who understood value perfectly still let go of his own discipline. And last, to a business partner, I invented an unreliable, moody man named Mr. Market, who will teach you, by the end, exactly who your real opponent has been all along. Let me take you back to 1926. I was 32 years old, working analysis on Wall Street, and I had developed something of a habit most of my colleagues considered a waste of time. I read filings, not summaries of filings, the filings themselves. That year, every pipeline company in America was required, for the first time, to submit detailed financial statements to the Interstate Commerce Commission. Most of Wall Street shrugged. Pipeline companies were dull. Nobody made money getting excited about pipelines. I took a train to Washington anyway, not because I expected to find anything remarkable. I simply wanted to see the filings for myself. Northern Pipeline Company, a small, forgotten spin-off from the old Standard Oil empire, was trading at $65 a share. Unremarkable. Except that buried in its filing was a fact nobody on Wall Street had bothered to notice. The company was sitting on railroad bonds worth $95 for every single share outstanding. The business itself, the actual pipeline operations, were almost incidental. The real asset was cash and bonds, hidden in plain sight in a document any broker could have requested for the price of a stamp. Here is where I want to slow down, because this is the part people misunderstand about that story. The arithmetic was not difficult. $65 buying $95 of assets is not a subtle insight. It is a child's math problem dressed up in a company's annual report. Any analyst willing to spend an afternoon in a library could have found what I found. This part, the numbers, the arithmetic, this part, is not where the story gets interesting. What is interesting is the part that has nothing to do with numbers at all. Why did nobody else go looking? Why did a fact sitting in a public filing sit there unclaimed for anyone with a train ticket and a free afternoon? The answer is not intelligence. Wall Street in 1926 was not short on intelligent men. The answer is habit, the habit of trusting the price on the ticker instead of trusting the arithmetic underneath it. Most investors, then and now, treat the quoted price of a stock as a kind of verdict, handed down by an authority smarter than themselves. It rarely occurs to them that the price is simply what the last 2 people agreed to, and that the last 2 people may have agreed to something foolish. I want to pause on this point about habit a little longer, because I think it is more important than the story itself. Wall Street has always had more than enough intelligent people. What it has never had in abundant supply is people willing to spend an unglamorous afternoon confirming, line by line, whether a company's stated numbers actually mean what everyone assumes they mean. This work does not photograph well. Nobody tells an exciting story at dinner about the hours spent cross-referencing a balance sheet against a footnote 3 pages later. And so, generation after generation, the same opportunity repeats itself in slightly different clothing. A piece of information sits in plain view, technically available to anyone, and yet remains functionally invisible because almost nobody does the unglamorous work of looking. I would go so far as to say that the scarcest resource on Wall Street has never been capital. It has always been patience applied to boring documents. I would later come to divide investors into two broad kinds: the defensive investor, who wants safety and freedom from worry above all else, and the enterprising investor, who is willing to spend real time and effort hunting for exactly this kind of overlooked fact. Northern Pipeline was, in a sense, the birth of that second category in my own mind long before I ever put a name to it. It was not capital that separated me from every other analyst who could have found that filing. It was the willingness to treat a dull government requirement as an afternoon's worth of homework rather than something to be skimmed and dismissed. This is worth naming plainly, because I intend to keep naming it all night. There is the arithmetic of a business, which can be checked, verified, and settled beyond argument. And there is the psychology of the crowd pricing that business, which no mathematics on earth will ever tame. Confuse the two, and you will spend your life reacting to the second while believing you understand the first. I have come to think of the stock market, taken as a whole, the way I once described it in my own book, as a kind of huge laundry where large institutions take in great blocks of each other's washing back and forth without much thought for what any particular item is actually worth. Everyone is busy trading with everyone else. Almost nobody stops to examine the goods. Northern Pipeline was one piece of laundry nobody had bothered to examine. So I examined it. I began buying shares quietly, not many, not enough to alarm anyone, just enough to become, within a matter of months, the second largest shareholder in the company after the Rockefeller Foundation itself. Then I did something far more difficult than the arithmetic. I asked the company to give the money back to its owners. I had traveled to that meeting alone, an overnight train to Pittsburgh, followed by an uncomfortable local train the rest of the way to Oil City, Pennsylvania. Hardly the image of a Wall Street financier arriving to make demands. I mention the discomfort of the trip deliberately because I think people imagine conviction as something dramatic, and it rarely is. Conviction, in my experience, looks like a tired man on an uncomfortable train, going anyway, because the arithmetic in his notebook was more persuasive to him than the inconvenience of the journey. I will spare you every detail of the fight, and it was a fight, not a negotiation. I made my case, put forward a motion that the company distribute its excess capital to shareholders, and not one person in that room would even second the motion. The chairman asked if anyone would second it. Nobody spoke. The meeting was adjourned in under a minute, and I went home with nothing. I want you to sit with that for a moment because it says something important about how markets actually work. I was right. I had the numbers. I had done the work nobody else had bothered to do. And in that room, being right counted for exactly nothing, because being right and being persuasive are two wholly different disciplines, and Wall Street rewards the second one far more reliably than the first. So I went back to work not on the arithmetic, which was already settled, but on the psychology. I spent the next year meeting in person with every shareholder who owned more than 100 shares, laying out the same numbers, one conversation at a time, until I had gathered enough support to force real change. By 1928, the company distributed the assets. Shareholders who had held on over time saw the value of their holding rise by more than 70% above where I had first bought in. There is a detail from that campaign I have always found worth mentioning because it undercuts a certain romantic idea people have about confrontation on Wall Street. I was not a natural fighter. I did not relish the meetings, the confrontations, the awkward negotiations with lawyers 3 times my size and reputation. What carried me through that year was not boldness so much as an unwillingness to let an obviously correct fact go unclaimed simply because claiming it required discomfort. Later, after the company had made its distribution, John D. Rockefeller himself, the very man whose foundation controlled the largest stake in Northern Pipeline, took note of what had happened and by several accounts began encouraging other former Standard Oil affiliates to review their own excess holdings. The man I had, in effect, challenged ended up adopting a version of my own argument. I mention this not to flatter myself, but because it illustrates something true about arithmetic done honestly. It does not require the other side to be foolish or dishonest. It only requires that nobody, until you arrive, has bothered to look closely enough to see it. Here is what I took from Northern Pipeline, and what I would ask you to take from it too. Finding the truth in a business is the easy half of the work. It is a skill you can teach and learn and apply with a calculator and an afternoon. Getting the market or a room full of stubborn shareholders to eventually agree with that truth is an entirely different kind of work, and it has almost nothing to do with arithmetic. It is closer to patience, closer to nerve. I walked away from that pipeline company believing I had learned the hardest lesson the market had to teach me. I want you to remember that belief, because in a few years, the market was going to teach me something far harder, not about finding value in a business, but about holding on to my own judgment when everything around me insisted I was wrong. By 1929, I had built something I was frankly quite proud of. My partnership managed $2.5 million, a considerable sum, put together dollar by dollar, largely through work of the kind I just described to you. I had structured much of it carefully, long positions balanced against short positions so that a falling market would not wipe us out. That much was sound. That much was arithmetic, or rather, most of it was arithmetic, and the arithmetic was correct. But I had also, alongside that careful hedge, built an additional position, several $1 million of stock, unhedged, bought partly with borrowed money. And here I want to be honest with you in a way I was not always honest with myself at the time. There was no clever justification for this. I believed, the way every man believes in the middle of a long bull market, that I had simply gotten better at this than most people, and that the ordinary rules of caution applied to ordinary investors, not to me. You will notice something about that sentence. It contains no arithmetic at all. It is pure psychology, dressed up as confidence. I remember in the final months before the crash, sitting in the enormous office of a well-known financier named Bernard Baruch, a man nearly 30 years my senior, who had built one of the great fortunes of his generation. He made me an extraordinary offer that day to become his partner, to give up my own business entirely and manage his fortune alongside him. We spent that meeting agreeing almost casually that the market had climbed to absurd heights, that speculation had gone half mad, that the entire structure would have to end sooner or later in a serious reckoning. I remember making something of a joke to him about interest rates and dividend yields eventually reversing their strange relationship. We were, in other words, two men who understood perfectly well in the abstract that disaster was coming. I want you to notice what that agreement did not do. It did not stop me, only months later, from holding a large unhedged position, bought partly on borrowed money, in the very market we had just finished calling half mad. Understanding a danger intellectually and protecting yourself from it in practice are two very different accomplishments. And I have come to believe that most financial ruin happens exactly at that gap between what a man knows and what a man does, while his own money is the one at risk. The market broke in the autumn of 1929, and my partnership lost 20% that year. Painful, but survivable better, in fact, than the broader market's decline. I remember thinking, with something close to relief, that we had weathered the worst of it. We had not weathered the worst of it. 1930 arrived, and with it, in my own words at the time, the worst year of the 33-year history of my fund management. We lost 50.5%, half of everything gone in 12 months. 1931 brought another 16%. By the time 1932 limped to its close, a year in which we finally barely held our losses to only 3%, my partnership had lost 70% of its capital since that proud $2.5 million we held in January of 1929. 70 cents of every dollar gone. I remember in those years giving up a duplex apartment overlooking Central Park for something considerably more modest a few blocks away. I mention this not because the apartment mattered, it never did, but because moving out of it was the first moment the arithmetic stopped being an abstraction on a ledger and became something my own family could see and feel every day in the size of the rooms we now lived in. Numbers on a page are easy to argue with. A smaller apartment is not. I want to separate out loud the two different failures buried inside that number because they are not the same failure, and confusing them is exactly how a man repeats his mistakes without noticing. The first failure was arithmetic. I had borrowed money to hold unhedged positions in a market already trading at extraordinary heights. That is a calculation any competent analyst, including myself, on any ordinary day would have flagged as reckless. The numbers were never mysterious. I could have run them on a single sheet of paper. The second failure had nothing to do with numbers at all, and it is the one I find harder to speak about even now. I did not hold that unhedged position because I miscalculated the risk. I held it because some part of me, the part untouched by all my training in security analysis, had come to believe that the market's rising price was itself a kind of proof, that the crowd's enthusiasm confirmed my judgment rather than the other way around. I had, without quite noticing, let Wall Street's opinion of me become more persuasive than my own arithmetic. This is, I think, the most dangerous trick the market plays on an intelligent man, more dangerous than any bad tip, any false rumor. It does not attack your ability to calculate. It attacks your certainty about which voice in your head to trust, the one holding the calculator or the one watching the ticker climb and feeling for the first time in years entirely vindicated. What weighed on me most during those years was never really the arithmetic of the loss itself. A man can absorb a number, however large, if he can see an end to it. What wore on me was the uncertainty of not knowing whether the losses would ever stop, month after month, watching every apparent recovery dissolve into a fresh decline. I was responsible in those years, not only for my own household, but for relatives and old friends who had entrusted me with what savings they had, and their fear became, in a way, a second burden layered on top of my own. I do not tell you this to seek your sympathy. I tell you because the numbers alone, 70%, 50.5%, 3%, cannot convey what it actually felt like to live inside them, and I think an honest accounting of any financial mistake has to include that feeling, or it teaches only half the lesson. By 1933, the very depths of the Depression for most of the country, my partnership earned back 50%, because the same bargains I had once traveled to Washington to find in a pipeline company's filing were now scattered across the entire market, priced as though the companies themselves had stopped being worth anything at all. By 1935, every dollar of the loss had been recovered. But recovery is not the lesson. The lesson sits earlier, in 1929, in the decision to hold an unhedged position because the market's enthusiasm had quietly become my own. I did not need better arithmetic to avoid that mistake. I already had the arithmetic. What I needed and did not yet have was a way of recognizing my own temperament as a variable in the equation, every bit as real and every bit as dangerous as any number on a balance sheet. It was out of those very years, out of watching my own understanding fail to protect me, that I eventually sat down with my colleague David Dodd and began writing what would become a rather lengthy book on the subject of security analysis. I did not write it to show off what I already knew. I wrote it in large part to build something sturdier than my own memory and my own resolve, a written discipline I could return to on the mornings when memory and resolve were not enough. It would take me the better part of 2 decades and a good deal more thought than the original Northern Pipeline analysis ever required to build that recognition into something I could actually use, something durable enough to survive not just one bad year, but a lifetime of markets doing precisely what markets do, which is behave unreasonably for reasons that have very little to do with reason at all. So here is where we stand. I have shown you a market that rewards patience and precision, and I have shown you in my own history a man who possessed both and still lost 70 cents on every dollar entrusted to him. If understanding the arithmetic of a business were sufficient, I should never have needed the second half of this story at all. Which leaves us with the real question, the one I spent the rest of my working life trying to answer. If the man who wrote the book on value could still lose to himself, what exactly does it take to win? The answer I eventually arrived at did not come from a spreadsheet. It came from a story I invented sometime in the years after the Depression to explain to my students at Columbia something I could not explain any other way. Imagine I told them that you own a small share in a private business, not a listed stock, just a quiet, ordinary company, the kind with real earnings and a real balance sheet. You have a partner in this business, and his name is Mr. Market. Mr. Market is, in every other respect, a wonderfully obliging man. Every single day, without fail, he shows up at your door and quotes you a price. He will tell you exactly what he believes your share of the business is worth today, and he will make you two offers at that price. He will buy your share from you, or he will sell you more of his own. Here is a difficulty with Mr. Market, and it is not a small one. He is, well, let me just say it plainly, an unstable man. Some days he arrives brimming with optimism, certain the business is about to prosper beyond anyone's imagination, and he names a price so high you would be foolish not to sell to him. Other days he arrives in the depths of gloom, convinced the business is finished, and he names a price so low you would be foolish not to buy from him. His mood has almost nothing to do with what actually happened at the business that week. It has everything to do with whatever fear or enthusiasm happens to be circulating in his own mind that particular morning. Now, and this is the part my students always found difficult to believe at first, Mr. Market does not mind in the slightest if you ignore him. He is not selling anything you are obligated to buy. He does not require an answer. He will simply return again tomorrow with an entirely new price, whatever your answer was today. I want to name out loud exactly where the arithmetic ends and the psychology begins in this parable, because the whole lesson depends on seeing the line clearly. The value of the business itself, its earnings, its assets, its prospects, is a question of arithmetic. It can be studied, estimated, argued over with facts. Mr. Market's daily quotation is not that. It is pure psychology, a mood dressed up as a number, and it deserves no more authority over your judgment than any other man's mood deserves over yours. This is where most investors, I have found, get the relationship exactly backward. They assume that because Mr. Market shows up every day with such confidence, his opinion must carry some special weight, as though persistence were the same thing as wisdom. And so they let his daily mood set their own. When he is euphoric, they become euphoric and buy. When he is despairing, they become despairing and sell. They have, without quite noticing, handed the keys of their own judgment to the most unreliable man on the street. I have watched this play out again and again among professional money managers who should know better than anyone. Many of them have no real choice in the matter. Clients pour money in exactly when Mr. Market is most enthusiastic, and the manager, under pressure to keep pace, buys more of what is already expensive. At the very moment, prices have grown most dangerous. They are not unintelligent men. They have simply arranged their circumstances so that they must follow Mr. Market's mood rather than their own arithmetic, which is, I would suggest, the least enviable position an investor can occupy. The ordinary individual, sitting quietly with his own capital and no client demanding an explanation by Friday, has an advantage over these professionals that he rarely appreciates. He is free to simply wait. He is under no obligation to trade with Mr. Market at all on any day when the man's mood seems least trustworthy. The intelligent approach, and I want to be careful here, because I am not asking you to ignore Mr. Market entirely, which would be its own kind of foolishness. The intelligent approach is to let him serve you rather than instruct you. You do business with him only when his price happens to serve your interest, and you are perfectly free on any given day to simply not answer the door. His job is to provide you with a number. Your job, and this is the only job that actually matters, is to decide for yourself, using your own arithmetic, whether that number has anything to do with reality. More likely than not, if history is any guide, a man who trains himself to think this way will do reasonably well over the years, not because he outsmarts every fluctuation, but because he stops letting fluctuations make his decisions for him. I would not put it any more strongly than that. I have watched too many confident predictions fail to make promises about what tomorrow's market will do. I have said, in other settings, that the market behaves over short stretches, something like a voting machine, tallying up whatever popularity a business happens to enjoy in a given week with all the fickleness that implies. But given enough time, it behaves instead like a weighing machine, settling eventually on something much closer to what a business is actually worth. Mr. Market is the voting machine. Arithmetic, patiently applied, is the weighing machine. The trouble is that almost everyone lives emotionally inside the voting machine's time frame, checking the tally daily while claiming to believe in the weighing machine's slower verdict. You cannot have it both ways. If you have truly done the arithmetic and trust it, the voting machine's daily tally should interest you a good deal less than it currently does. Now let me bring this back to the two stories I told you earlier, because I did not choose them by accident. Northern Pipeline was, in its way, my first encounter with a market too distracted to notice value, sitting in plain sight, a market behaving in miniature, exactly like Mr. Market on one of his indifferent days. That story taught me the arithmetic side of the lesson, that price and value are not the same thing, and the gap between them is where the patient man makes his living. 1929 through 1932 taught me the other half, the half I resisted learning for far longer because it was a good deal less comfortable. It taught me that I myself was not immune to Mr. Market's moods, that I could understand his unreliability perfectly in the abstract and still let his enthusiasm infect my own judgment when I was the one standing in the middle of the party. Knowing that Mr. Market is unstable does not protect you from him. Only the discipline of refusing to answer his door on the days his mood is most persuasive actually protects you. That is why I say to you now, and I say it with the full weight of what it cost me to learn it, the investor's chief problem, and more often than not, his very worst enemy, is likely to be himself. Not the market, not the economy, not some clever operator working against him from the other side of the trade. Himself, on an ordinary Tuesday, standing at his own door, deciding whether to let a moody stranger's opinion become his own. I want to close not with more arithmetic, because I think you have had enough of it for one evening, but with something closer to the truth of the matter. Every investor who has ever lost money to the market swings has at some point done so with full access to the same facts everyone else had. The information was rarely the problem. I did not lose 70% of my partnership's capital in 1930 because a fact was hidden from me. I lost it because of very ordinary human weakness, the desire to believe that a run of good fortune reflects some permanent truth about my own judgment was allowed to override arithmetic I already possessed. If you take nothing else from tonight, take this. The market will always be exactly as unreliable as Mr. Market himself on any given day for the rest of your life. That is not a flaw in the system that some future reform will correct. It is the nature of a system built from thousands of people, each reacting to the last piece of news, each half convinced that the crowd around them knows something they don't. Expecting the market to behave sensibly is a little like expecting a single unreliable man to suddenly become dependable because you badly need him to be. He will not. He was never going to. So the real question was never how to fix the market. It was how to fix your own relationship to it, how to build deliberately, ahead of time, before the next mister. Market shows up at your door in a state of wild enthusiasm or wild despair, a set of habits sturdy enough to survive contact with your own worst impulses. I will tell you plainly that I did not arrive at this discipline through cleverness. I arrived at it through the particular humiliation of watching my own certainty fail me in 1930, at a moment when certainty was exactly what I could least afford to trust. It is not a comfortable way to learn a lesson, and I would not recommend it to anyone who has an easier path available. The easier path, as far as I can tell, is simply to accept in advance calmly, without waiting for a crisis to force the point that you personally are capable of exactly the kind of foolishness you can so easily spot in other people. Not because you are unusually weak, but because you are, after all, a person, and persons are not built for cold indifference to a rising or falling number that represents their own savings. Once you accept that about yourself, the practical steps become almost simple. Decide on a calm day what you believe a business is actually worth. using arithmetic you trust. Decide on that same calm day what you will do if Mr. Market offers you a wildly different price before his mood has had the chance to become your own. Write it down if you have to. I have found that a decision made in a quiet room survives a crisis far better than a decision made while the ticker is moving. Consider what this looks like in practice. Two men own identical shares in the same well-run business. The market falls hard one week for reasons that have nothing to do with that business's actual earnings. The first man, having decided in advance what he believes the business is worth, checks his own arithmetic, finds nothing has changed, and does nothing, perhaps even buys more, if his conviction and his cash both allow it. The second man, having made no such decision in advance, watches the price fall, feels his stomach drop along with it, and sells, purely because watching a number fall for 5 straight days is a deeply uncomfortable experience for almost any human being. Both men own the same business. Only one of them has done anything to deserve the outcome he eventually gets. None of this will make the market kinder. It was never going to be kind. But a man who has made his peace with an unreliable partner and decided in advance exactly how much attention that partner's moods deserve tends to sleep considerably better than the man still waiting for his partner to finally start making sense. I have told this same story in one form or another to a great many students over the years at Columbia, young men who arrived certain that what they needed from me was a better formula. Most of them left, I think, with something closer to a mirror. The formula for finding value in a business, once learned properly, does not change very much from year to year. What changes endlessly, unpredictably, is the state of mind a man brings to using it, whether he can hold to his own arithmetic on the one afternoon a year when holding to it actually costs him something. I do not say any of this as a warning meant to frighten you away from the market altogether. Quite the opposite. The market, taken over a full lifetime, has rewarded patient, disciplined people extraordinarily well, myself included. In the end, once I had learned to distrust my own certainty at exactly the right moments, the danger was never in participating. The danger was in participating without first deciding on a calm afternoon which parts of my judgment I could trust completely and which parts needed a rule standing guard over them, because I could not always trust myself to remember in the middle of a crisis what I already knew perfectly well on a quiet day. I am an old man now, telling you a young man's mistake, his and mine, since I'm not sure there's much difference, and I suspect that is precisely why it is worth hearing. The lesson does not arrive gently. It rarely does. But it is available to you now, tonight, at far less cost than it was available to me in 1930, provided you are willing to do the one thing that discipline has always required and cleverness has never been able to replace. Decide in advance, on a quiet evening like this one, exactly how much power you intend to hand over to a man whose only real skill is showing up at your door with an opinion. If there is a comedy buried inside tonight's story, it is this. I built my entire reputation on convincing others to trust arithmetic over emotion, while quietly needing 30 cents on the dollar, and 3 brutal years to convince myself of the very same thing. I spent the better part of my life teaching people how to calculate what a business is worth. The far more expensive lesson, the one it took a depression and 30 cents on the dollar to teach me, was learning to calculate the worth of my own patience.